Hello and welcome to the Pharmacy Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Dr. Alex Barker, founder and CEO of the Happy Farm D, where we help pharmacists get jobs they love. Today, I have an interesting podcast, and it's about whistleblowing. I don't know about you, but I was taught to not be a tattletale. But I was also taught to follow the rules. And those two things don't always work in the workplace. There are fraudulent activities going on everywhere, and especially in healthcare. And today I've invited an expert on fraudulent claims. His name is Jon Tyko. He's one of the founding partners and lawyers at fraudfighters.net. He's also the host of the podcast, the Garrulous Gavel, which is a very fun adjective that I've never said before publicly, and I hope I pronounced it correctly. Jon is a lawyer and provides incredible insights about the roadblocks that people have to bringing forth blower claims, and talks about how there's not actually a lot of consequences for people who bring them forward, and actually how there is significant reward, which I did not even really know that, to the amount that you can earn by bringing forth actual fraudulent claims to the government. Whistleblower, I feel like, has some stigma around it. And I think in this episode, you're going to learn more about this. And if you feel like you have something to bring forward, you're going to have some next action steps to go forward and ultimately make our healthcare system better. So, with that, let's jump into the interview. Hey, Jon, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So, we're here to talk about whistleblowing and a little bit of your background and experience without getting into too many details. And I started to ask you before I hit the record button, whistleblowing sounds like the vernacular, but is there a technical term? What is whistleblowing, and how does it work from your point of view as a lawyer?
Well, when people ask me what I do, I say that I represent corporate whistleblowers. And that is generally a good description that people can understand. There are more technical ways to describe it under the various laws that we operate under. And our clients are not always purely traditional whistleblowers, the way people think of them. But as a starting point and to sort of give people a sense of what I do as a lawyer, I think it's as good as any. Yeah.
And it's certainly something that has a lot of stigma around it. I think that has changed over the years, but I think it would be helpful for people to give a little bit of background about you. How did you get into this very niche part of the legal system?
Well, I've been a lawyer for about 30 years, and I've been doing what I do now, representing corporate whistleblowers, for about half that time. So the very first client I had in one of these cases was about halfway through my career. I had already been practicing for about 15 years, doing various types of civil litigation. And I got a call from a person who said, I'm a relator in a key TAM case. And I had no idea what he was talking about.
Okay.
and I said, what's that? and then he proceeded to explain to me a little bit of what his case was about. And it turns out that the term relator is the technical term for the whistleblower under the False Claims Act, which is the statute that we operate under most of the time. And so that one sort of client, somewhat out of the blue, I mean, he was referred to me for a reason, but that was my introduction to the False Claims Act and to representing whistleblowers. And I found it so interesting that when I was done with that case, I thought, well, gee, it would be fun and rewarding and an interesting practice to see if I can get some more of these. And so slowly, built the practice over time. And now it's pretty much 100% of what I do.
Wow. It's me. At first, I was kind of felt with a little bit of remorse that there's so much of it going on, because it implies that bad things are happening. um, but perhaps it is a good thing, right? That people are coming forward.
Well,
Um,
yeah, I mean, I can say, particularly in the healthcare industry, which I guess is probably where we should focus the conversation today. What I do is broader than just healthcare, but healthcare is a very significant portion of it. More than a majority of it actually is in the healthcare world. And I will say that in the healthcare world, um, a huge percentage of the government's enforcement actions, where they actually go after wrongdoing and recover money, something like 70 or 80% of those cases actually start with whistleblowers. So the
mm,
whistleblowers play a really key role in the government's enforcement efforts. And although, nobody likes to be on the receiving end of a government subpoena or a lawsuit, what I tell people in the business is that, look, if you are a good faith honest player in the healthcare business, it works to your advantage, and it works to everybody's advantage to try to get the bad actors kind of wrung out of the system, because they are wasting money that should go to actual healthcare. They are competing against honest players unfairly, um, and they're just causing trouble for everybody in lots of other ways we could talk about. So it really, you're right that the idea of a whistleblower sometimes comes with some stigma, and I think there's some interesting psychological reasons for why that is. But the role that they play in the system, I think, is overwhelmingly positive.
yeah, this is something that you and I talked about before we recorded this. That I think a lot of people go throughout their jobs and may at times feel like they see something is off. Their internal red flags go off and say, I don't know about this. I don't know if it's right. Um, and I think to your point, there is fear about the consequences of going forward and saying something. Um, I would venture to say that most pharmacists in particular don't want to be boat shakers. We don't want to rock the boat. We don't want
Right.
to typically speak bad about our employer, especially when we may be afraid about the future of our career. If I come forward and say something, does this kind of ban me from ever practicing pharmacy again? Will anybody hire me again?
Yeah.
I'm sure you've run into clients who have similar fears.
Absolutely. I mean, this is always a topic of conversation when somebody comes to us who is thinking about doing this. I mean, usually the first conversations are usually like, well, I know this thing is going on at my employer. I'm not sure what I'm going to do. Right. So a lot of our initial conversations with clients are around sort of, well, what is the process going to be? What are the potential consequences?
Hmm.
And you're right. I mean, there are some very concrete concerns that whistleblowers often have about their career, about getting blacklisted, losing their job.
Hmm.
And then there's just all of the psychological consequences, which you also alluded to, which is that, there's this very strong human instinct to want to get along with the people we're around. It takes
Yeah.
a certain kind of psychological fortitude to sort of break away from the pack and say, no, 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 what we're doing is wrong.
Right.
This
You're
has been
basically
studied by
being a tattletale, right?
yeah, I mean, that would be the negative. That would be the negative way to think about it, right?
And we were taught
But
from a young age, you don't do that. You gotta
yeah,
cut that
yeah.
out.
Well, that's interesting. I think we're taught two different things. We're taught not to be tattletales, but we're also taught, that we should follow the law, and
Right.
that we shouldn't give in to bullies, and that we should stand up for what's right.
Mhm.
And these things are often in conflict. And I think, being a whistleblower, particularly if you are an employee and you are inside the organization that you are going to blow the whistle on, that is a really tricky psychological space. There's no question about it. You should probably have a psychologist on at some point to talk about it.
Yeah.
But we sort of play this sort of therapist role with our clients a little bit sometimes. There's no doubt that that is a tricky psychological space, and the people that come forward and do decide to do it tend to be people that have a lot of moral fortitude, moral fiber, and are kind of able to kind of withstand that psychological pressure.
In the world of pharmacy, it sounds like based on the Fraud Claims Act that you've mentioned before, which I don't know if all pharmacists are aware of, could you explain a little bit more about that
Mhm.
and how maybe some examples of what it could look like within our industry?
Sure. So the False Claims Act, that is the law that authorizes what are called qui tam actions. Qui tam is just short for a long Latin phrase, which means that it's an action brought by a private individual, but in the name of the government. So these are cases where the underlying claim is that somebody has committed fraud on the government or on a government funded program. And this intersects the healthcare industry quite a bit, just because so much of healthcare is funded by the government through Medicare, Medicaid,
Yeah.
TRICARE, the other government funded programs. So any sort of fraud scheme in the healthcare world is likely to also violate the False Claims Act, just by virtue of the fact that so many of the claims for payment are going to be submitted to these government funded programs. And so a private individual who has information about a fraud like that can bring one of these cases. And they have a lot of very unique rules. They're very different than normal lawsuits for a whole host of reasons. The cases are filed originally what's called under seal, which means that they're sort of secret, and the defendant, the party that you are claiming is committing the fraud, doesn't know that they've been sued, at least at the beginning of the case. And you have to work with the government, with the Department of Justice, and in healthcare cases with Health and Human Services to help them investigate your fraud. And this statute is sort of a vehicle for bringing that information to the government. And if it's successful, and successful in the sense that the government actually recovers money, then the person that brings the case, who brought that information to the government, is entitled to a financial reward that is measured as a percentage of what the government recovers, anywhere from 15 to 30%. And some of these cases are quite large, millions, tens of millions, even in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars. So the rewards can be in the millions of dollars as well in larger cases. So there's a large sort of financial incentive, or at least financial compensation, for having done this in
Mm.
the cases that are successful. If the cases are not successful, you don't get that. So you have to be willing to stick your neck out a little bit and take some risk to be a whistleblower under this statute.
So to clarify, before you move on to examples, um, it sounds like there is potential then that someone could bring forth a claim, have the government investigate it, and then the employer becomes aware of the investigation and the person that brought it forward?
Eventually. So when the lawsuit is filed, it's under seal, so it's secret. And so the defendant, your employer in your example, does not know about the lawsuit initially.
Hmm.
The government, though, will open an investigation of your allegations, assuming that they think there's enough credible evidence in support of it. So not any allegation, but if you have a credible evidence with some evidence, a credible allegation with some evidence in support of it, the government will open an investigation. And it is possible that your employer could learn about the investigation. Now, you could get an audit request, or what's called a CID, a civil investigative demand, which is basically like a subpoena. And
Oof.
those won't tell the employer that the reason why the government is doing that is because there was a whistleblower.
Mhm.
But depending on the nature of your employment and the nature of the employer, there are we've certainly had clients who have said to us, look, once my employer gets the subpoena, they're going to know it was me because I was the only one who knew about this stuff, or something like that. But so it depends on the circumstances. But the government does that investigation. At the end of that investigation, which is often several years after you file the case, so this is a long process. At the end of that investigation, often the cases are unsealed because the defendant does have a right to then defend themselves in court. So at some point, they are unsealed and the defendant is told about the case. And at
Mm.
that point, typically, the whistleblower loses their anonymity. So what we tell clients is, you'll be sort of temporarily anonymous, but we certainly cannot guarantee that nobody's ever going to know that you brought this lawsuit. You do have to be willing to stand behind it.
It kind of feels like a spy thriller, with a little bit of like, um, um, oh, who are those people? Bounty hunters,
Yeah.
like there's kind of like a Wild West feeling to all of this that puts to your point, a considerable amount of psychological pressure on the person, showing up to work, knowing potentially that there's some fraudulent activities going on while still working a job and pretending as if everything is fine. Um,
Right. Yeah, not
so,
everybody ends up in that situation, though. I will say that um, many of our clients choose at some point to seek other employment. I mean,
mm,
again, these cases can take quite a while, it can take several years. And as you might imagine, somebody who is willing to take this step and basically bring one of these cases is probably not super happy with their employer. So, what we find often is that even if our client is inside the company when the case starts, usually they're also in the job market, and at some point they get out, although we have had clients who have stayed in for quite a while.
mm. What have been some examples that you've seen through your practice?
That are specifically pharmacy related.
Yeah, if you have any, or
Oh,
know
sure.
cases.
Yeah, no, no, no. A lot of the interesting healthcare cases lately have been in the pharmacy or pharmaceutical kind of realm. I will say, like uh, the Supreme Court takes cases under the False Claims Act every now and then, and they
Yeah.
had a case just this year that was the biggest False Claims Act case of this Supreme Court term that involved pharmacies. It involved UNC, I'm sorry, their usual and customary charges for pharmaceuticals, and these were the defendants in these cases were large chains, Safeway and SuperValue, that were alleged to have committed fraud in the reporting of their usual and customary charges for pharmaceuticals. And and those cases went all the way up to the Supreme Court on a somewhat technical issue under the False Claims Act. So those cases are still ongoing. We've also seen a lot of cases. I would say the cases kind of break down into sort of two categories. One that relates to the marketing of pharmacies and pharmaceuticals, and then another group that roughly you could describe as cases that relate to the dispensing, right? So on the marketing side, the big issue is often what's known as the anti-kickback statute,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
um, and which applies to basically everybody in the healthcare industry, that says you can't provide things of value in order to induce referrals, and that applies to pharmacies. We can talk about some examples of how pharmacists have gotten into trouble under that. And then on the dispensing side, I think a lot of the really interesting cases these days relate to what I think of as kind of medical necessity issues. So
Okay.
probably the biggest, most interesting cases right now involve opioid dispensing.
Mm.
The Department of Justice has brought a number of cases against some larger pharmacy chains. I think Rite Aid is the defendant, and one of the big ones that's going forward,
Yeah.
where the allegation is essentially that the pharmacy should have known that the prescriptions for opioids that were being dispensed were not actually medically justified, medically necessary. And if a claim is made to Medicare or Medicaid for a service or product that is not medically necessary, in theory, it's not covered. So the theory of these cases is, once Rite Aid or the other defendants had enough data to know that certain providers were writing prescriptions that were just feeding people's addictions and were not really medically indicated, that they had an obligation to not fill those prescriptions. So, and there's been other cases kind of that sort of touch on these sort of issues of what is the obligation of pharmacists to sort of police the prescriptions that they're getting, or to make sure that products are being provided in the right amounts. Cases involving overfilling or over provision of certain kinds of products. So that's a whole category, another area where I think pharmacies can get into trouble.
Yes. I think through pharmacy school, we're introduced to a lot of these significant cases or examples of, pharmacists, how they bend the rules and how there's consequences, for
Mhm.
those. Um, I unfortunately, we'll be misquoting this article that I just reviewed and shared on social media, I think a couple weeks ago. It was something to the effect of it was either Nevada or Arizona that was suing, that had won a case against one of the major retail chains for $500 million because of the opioid epidemic.
Right.
And I mean, $1 billion to me is an intangible amount of, like, I can't wrap my mind around a
Yeah.
billion. But to then say, okay, well, you're going to give us a half of $1 billion for the damages. That's one state. So more is coming. In For our audience, they may not be aware of something going on, or maybe they feel like something is going on. What would you recommend people do if they have maybe some evidence in their minds where they feel like there's something to be done about this issue? Something does not feel right. What would be a great first step for them?
Well, the one thing to remember is the False Claims Act is not about mistakes. And sometimes things are just billed by mistake, or your employer just, is just sort of honestly doing something wrong. So if somebody just came to me and said, "Hey, I think we're billing for this, whatever product, and we're not doing it right, and I'm not sure," the first thing I would say is, well, have you talked to your boss about it?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of these issues, there are always reimbursement issues in any large healthcare business.
Yes.
You're
Yeah.
always going to be dealing with gray areas, with trying to figure out, how do we bill? We've got a lot of different insurance programs we have to bill to. It's complicated. Nobody likes this, dealing with this stuff in the healthcare business.
Yeah.
Sometimes mistakes are made, and that's fine. That's not what this law is intended. It's not intended to punish just honest mistakes.
Hmm.
So if somebody came to me with just that, I would say, well, go talk to your boss about it. Maybe they'll just fix it. Or maybe they have an explanation. And when you hear the explanation, you'll go, oh, okay, now I understand it. I mean, we don't want to bring a case to the Department of Justice unless we are pretty confident that a law is being broken, and that the company has some, some level of sort of culpability, that it's not just an honest mistake, that this is something systematic, that they either are doing it intentionally, or if they're not doing it intentionally, at least that they should have known better and should have fixed it and had an opportunity to fix it.
Hmm.
So that's the starting point. The starting point is always, well, see if you can just fix the problem first internally. um, and but I will say that most of the people that come to us have already done that, because coming to a lawyer and filing a lawsuit is nobody's first thought, right? So,
Right.
so most of the people, by the time they've called me, they are already convinced that their employer is doing something wrong, and also that their employer will not fix it.
Hmm.
Um, and then, we can sort of help them through the process and figure out, is there something really wrong going on here? Does it rise to the level of a False Claims Act violation, and so forth?
Yeah. So after that internal process, I can already see some pharmacist minds turning on this, where they're afraid to even bring it forward. Um, Afraid of what a boss will say. I've talked to enough people to know it may not be fraudulent activity, but I can confirm that a lot of people are afraid to bring forth issues for being
Mhm.
seen as uh, uh, difficult to work with, being framed as someone who isn't a team player, afraid of demotion, or even being fired for bringing up things. Um, I have my own perspective on it. For me, that those kinds of things kind of just adds fuel to the fire to say you probably aren't in the right place anyway. But
Right.
have you seen that in practice happen where people bring things forward and there's actual consequences for them in the workplace?
That's a great question. Everybody is worried about it, but I very, very rarely have seen it actually play out. I mean, the statute does also make it illegal to retaliate against an employee sort of opposing illegal conduct. So if you're an employee of a pharmacy and they're doing something that could violate the False Claims Act, and you complain to your boss and you get fired as a result, you then have your own personal claim. This is like an employment claim, right? It's sort of a wrongful termination or retaliation claim as well, which is totally apart from the key tam stuff. That's your own personal claim for your damages for being wrongly retaliated against. But we very rarely bring those claims. We do sometimes, but again, I think the main reason for that has to do with the fact that the cases are filed under seal anonymously originally, and often by the time they become public, so much time has passed that the whistleblower has often sort of moved on from a career perspective and is no longer beholden to that particular employer for a job or even a recommendation. they've just moved on to the next thing.
Yeah. I
And
can
people,
imagine. I mean,
yeah,
you're in a way you've kind of sold out any loyalty left, right? And you and I've never been in that position myself, but I can imagine that if working for someone, finding that they're doing all these wrong things is probably going to add up to not just disloyalty, but wanting to get out. I can't imagine people staying.
yeah. Yeah, and sometimes our clients are already out by the time they contact us. They've already been fired. They complained about something and did get fired, and then they have been retaliated against. But then they bring the lawsuit,
Oh,
or they've just left. They've moved on. They knew they couldn't stay working in that place. They've
yeah.
moved on to a new job, and it's now only sort of looking back that they're sort of willing to do something.
Um, I won't name names, but I actually know of a pharmacist who published a book about all of the problems within the system,
Hmm.
and talked about it in such a way that it's meant for the public and for things the public to do, like writing to legislatures and stuff. And I talked to this person after they published it because I was like, "You're making a potentially a career-ending statement. Um, uh, how does that feel?" Because I just thought it was insanely bold for this person to do so, and I found out that the person was asked to be on administrative leave for a couple of days from their job. Um, but as far as I'm aware of, they're still employed by the same company. Um, and it's funny, John. Every time I go to a pharmacy conference, I hear the rumblings. I hear people say things like, do we need a union to fight for our rights? Do we need to do this? They have all the power, just all of these, I wouldn't say damning claims of organizations, but everyone knows the things that need to change and the things that need to happen differently. But it's not fraud. It isn't fraud. Um,
Well, I'm kind of interested a little bit in where you're coming from on this because I'd like to kind of push back on it a little bit, which is that,
Please.
I mean, you're sort of positing a world in which the primary sort of attribute of an employee is loyalty and conformity. And while for a lot of people that is true, it is not true for everybody. I
Hmm.
think a lot of people value other things more than loyalty and conformity. And they value personal integrity. They value patriotism and doing what's right. And yeah, most people value loyalty and conformity over those things, and that's why there are so few whistleblowers. But the people who
Mm.
do come forward just have a different set of beliefs, a different sort of set of values that and so those folks, although sometimes they certainly have a part of them that is also worried about being the snitch, as you said, or being the tattletale. They just don't see that as the sort of foundation of their identity. Like
Mm.
they're okay with that, because they're going to accomplish something bigger and more important. um So I'm
Mm.
not so sure that everybody has the set of concerns that you're expressing. I would grant you that most people would, and most people, because of that, don't become whistleblowers. But not everybody sort of ascribes to that sort of hierarchy of values. Some people put other things above loyalty and conformity.
It's an excellent point. When I think about our profession at large, I do tend to think in generalities. And one thing that is established through our literature is that we are a team focused, consistent, and stable environment driven profession. Um, that does not mean that everyone's that way. I think I'm a testament to that. You don't see many pharmacists having podcasts.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, there's something entrepreneurial about being a whistleblower. It's sort of true.
yeah, that's true. You can make
It's a
money from
you
it.
can make money off it, but it's also just a personality thing. It's a little bit of
True.
like, I'm going to do my own thing and I'm not going to worry too much about what other people tell me.
Yeah, I could see all sorts of justifications for not doing it and doing it, and
Yeah.
and I appreciate your pushback. Um, I think the first thing that you have to come to terms with is what's the right thing, and what can I be at peace with? Because nothing bugs, I feel like, most pharmacists is doing something that feels wrong, especially when it involves patient care. Um, I feel like we are hyper tuned and trained to sense anything that could be off within the system. Um, it we haven't even gotten to your examples. I've been wanting to know what have been some of the pharmacy examples that you've seen in your practice.
Yeah, well, we talked a little bit about sort of the kickbacks cases. A big case that my firm worked on recently involved injectable insulin pens, I believe they're called, that were
Mhm.
being sold by PillPack, which is the sort of the Amazon
Yes.
online pharmacy, or one of their attempts to do online pharmacy. Um, and and I take it that, with respect, you probably know more about the details of this than I do, but that when these insulin pens are sold, there are particular rules about how many that you can sell to a patient at a time to make sure that you're not oversupplying the patient, and then that there is some reporting that has to be done back to the insurances to assure that. And a couple of big pharmaceutical companies have gotten into trouble because they had software programs that were supposed to track these things, but were actually not doing it right.
Hmm.
And because of that, they were sort of oversupplying and therefore overbilling for these pens. So that was a case that one of our firm's clients brought,
Hmm.
that settled just this past year for multiple millions of dollars. It was a fairly large case, and against a, a fairly big corporate defendant. Um, I've been involved in a number of healthcare kickback cases over the years. They're not all pharmaceuticals, but they all uh, involve, you know healthcare products. Some of them probably were actually dispensed by pharmacies. I was involved in a very large kickbacks case a number of years ago that related to an artificial, what they were billing as sort of like an artificial skin that was used to help with wound healing, primarily for diabetics. And this was a very expensive product, and it was being sold by a small sort of startup company, and this was their sort of like lead product. And they were trying to ramp up the sales of this product as quickly as they could, because they were owned by venture capital, which is something we could talk a little bit about, the role of venture capital in healthcare. But this was a venture capital owned company that was trying to ramp up sales very, very quickly, because the owners were hoping to sell the company once they had sufficient sales. So they hired a big sort of team of salespeople, and just sort of gave these salespeople sort of an unrestricted budget. And the salespeople were going in primarily into VA hospitals,
Ooh.
and were essentially bribing doctors and other providers in the hospitals to use their product as opposed to other things that they could have been using to treat these patients. And the product was way more expensive than the alternatives, and not particularly efficacious. So because of the kickbacks that they were paying, they very quickly went from like zero to like $100 million in sales at just within the VA system. They were doing this in the private side
Whoa.
as well, but just within the VA system. And they were able to sell the company to Shire Pharmaceuticals, a big pharmaceutical conglomerate, that paid, I think, $750 million for the company. And soon after Shire bought the company, they received a subpoena from the Department of Justice because of a case that my client and some other whistleblowers, there were multiple whistleblowers actually in that case, had brought this to the government's attention. Shire shut down the use of the kickbacks. And as soon as they did that, the sales just went off a cliff. And the doctors went back to using the things that were cheaper and worked better when they were no longer getting sort of the fun, as they called it. And that case ended up settling for about $350 million. So
Wow.
I think kickbacks, I will say about kickbacks is, I think this is an area where even kind of smaller players in the pharmaceutical pharmacy business can get into trouble, because a lot of things that count as kickbacks under the anti-kickback statute, people would not necessarily think are so bad. Things like copay waivers, which the government regards as a violation of the anti-kickback statute, and can be, but the flip side of that is sometimes from the perspective of the person giving the waiver, they just think they're doing the patient a sort of a service, giving them like a little tip. Here, you keep your $20. You need the money more than I. But that is regarded as a kickback, and or just little incentives, gift cards, little things that businesses, if you were in any other kind of business outside of healthcare, would be totally fine and normal. But in the healthcare business, can't do it, and you can get into a lot of trouble for that.
Are you aware of patient discount cards?
Oh yeah. There've been big. Well, I mean, this was part of those usual and customary charges cases, because what was happening there, the whole issue in those cases, the ones that went up to the Supreme Court, was that Safeway and SuperValue had these discount programs where they had a list price for the pharmaceuticals, but then they had these discount programs that a lot of people were using. And when they reported their usual and customary price, they were reporting their list price, not the discounted price, even though a very high percentage of their customers were actually getting the discounted price. That's the underlying issue in those cases. I mean, the issue that went in front of the Supreme Court was not actually about whether that practice was legal. It was about something else. But that is the underlying issue in those cases.
Do you have a professional opinion about discount cards? Because there's a lot of rumblings in pharmacy about what they are and what they do for people.
Well, I mean, there's two different problems. One is the UNC problem. So if you are a pharmacy that has to report UNC, you have to take those discounts into account. I don't think there's really any question about that anymore. I mean, there might have been a few years back. And then the other issue is the anti-kickback statute. Will the government regard the discounts as kickbacks? So the devil's a little bit in the details there. I guess all I would say is that if you run a pharmacy and you're thinking about doing something like that, just think about it, maybe get some legal advice, make sure you're doing it in a way that'll pass muster.
Well, this has been really insightful, and I've been thinking about this question this whole time, and I've been holding back.
Don't hold back. I like talking about this stuff.
When does I'll say pharmacist, but I would suppose anyone, when do you feel like someone should have, or what does it, I'm trying to think of how to word it right. When is the right time to reach out to a lawyer? How much sufficient evidence do you need in order to know that you have a whistleblower claim?
Yeah. Well, I would say, I mean, there's no reason if something is keeping you up at night and you think you could benefit from some advice, then you should reach out. I mean, the lawyers who do what I do, we spend a lot of our time actually just doing what we call case vetting. Somebody will call us and with a story. And the first thing we have to do is figure out, well, okay, this person has a story, but do they have a lawsuit? Those two things are not the same thing,
Yeah.
right? So a lot of what we do is just hearing the client's story. This is what is happening, right? And then, of course, we ask the logical question like, okay, what evidence do you have that you could show us that would prove that that's what's happening? Because ultimately, if you go forward with this case, you're going to have that conversation with a lawyer and a bunch of investigators from the Department of Justice. So we're just asking the same questions you're going to get asked down the road if you start walking down that road. So we need to know the answers. What kind of evidence are there? Is there a paper trail?
Mm.
If it's a billing fraud, show us an example of one of these bills that you say is fraudulent. Prove to us that it's actually fraudulent. If your claim is that the CEO of the company is telling you to do something that's illegal, well, where's the evidence that the CEO of the company knows about this and is actually giving that instruction? Is there something in writing? Are there other witnesses? Because
Yeah.
if all you have is your own story that you're going to tell yourself out of your own mouth, you're not going to get very far with the Department of Justice. They just have too many other cases they can work on. They're looking for cases where there is evidence. So
Mm.
we go through that vetting process with people. And quite often, at the end of that vetting process is some advice back to them like, well, we actually don't think you have a particularly strong case. If you were to file this case, we're not so sure you would get a good result. And a lot of times at that point, people say, okay, well, thank you. Then I won't file the case. And we do that for free. We don't charge people anything for that. And most of the lawyers who do what I do don't charge for that kind of vetting process. It's just part of our due diligence,
Mm.
in deciding whether to take the case as well for ourselves. So, and that process is all confidential. We're bound by attorney-client privilege and the ethics rules around confidentiality for lawyers. So you can get that kind of sort of feedback from a lawyer, like, do I have a case here? Kind of feedback, confidentially and usually for free.
Well, I think a great question to end on for you is if someone were to do that, they feel confident they have a case,
Mhm.
and they want to talk to you about it, where can they go to do that?
Me specifically?
Sure.
Well, yeah. Well, you can find me. I'm all over the internet. Our firm has a whole website that is devoted to our whistleblower practice, which has information about a lot of different kinds of whistleblower cases, about the whole process. That website is fraudfighters.net. .net. That's the important part. Fraudfighters.net. If you Google my name, Jon Tyko, you'll find me in a lot of different places. So I'm pretty easy to find.
Awesome. You have 30 plus years of experience, 15 years in whistleblowing. You've learned a lot through your journey. What do you wish you could go back in time and tell all of your clients, knowing what you know now?
I will say for my whistleblower clients, although for the reasons that you touched on at the beginning of this interview, a lot of them have a lot of worries and concerns at the beginning of the process. I don't think I've had many really, or perhaps none, who after the process was done felt any regrets. And that's true even for the clients who never made a single penny off the process. And I think that's really because the 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 clients who did decide to go forward with these cases after we went through our vetting process and after we concluded that what they were saying was true and could be proved, right? That they really felt good about what they were doing, that they were part of a positive process, that they were doing something good for the healthcare system, good for the country, and that they could just live with themselves and feel good about what they had done.
Awesome. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Happy Farm D podcast. Did you enjoy it? Let me know in the comments. You can find this on, I think, practically any podcast player app, but we're also on YouTube. If you're watching it live, how do you like the setup? I've significantly upgraded it. I don't know how long you've been following us for, but Man, my office before all of this was just a total drag. I mean, it was battleship gray walls, blech, gross. But we've significantly upgraded. I'd love to know, do you like the chair? I don't know. I hope so. And if you're just listening, don't worry. You don't have to take a look. It looks nice. At least I think it does. Thank you for listening to this episode. And I earnestly hope that if you feel like there's some fraud going, that you know what to do next. I'd encourage you to reach out to Jon or to seek ultimately to speak to people within your organization to talk about fixing it before taking significant action, like speaking with a lawyer for a claim. The goal of all people within healthcare is to make the system better, to help more people. We know that the system is broken. But it should be about making everything better so that we can save more lives, so that we can make a bigger impact and help more people. Thank you for listening to this episode. And if you at all have any career questions, wondering about maybe you do need to get out of the job that you're in, well, then you're listening to the expert. Hey, don't worry, we got you covered. I would encourage you to reach out to one of our career advisors. You can schedule a free call by going to our website at thehappyfarmd.com and have a free career assessment. Well, you'll talk about maybe any roadblocks you're having, big questions answered, like should I look outside of my own niche in pharmacy, or maybe even outside of the profession. We have helped people get jobs that they love on average 1.5 months after our program. I highly encourage you to check that out. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.